The first time anyone saw the little girl again, she was standing at the edge of the woods barefoot, her pale dress soaked in morning dew, her eyes fixed on something unseen between the trees. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. She simply stood there, clutching a crude ring made of twigs and animal sinew, as though it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The town had searched for her for a week, combing through every abandoned trail, every rusted fence line, every forgotten corner of the forest. They found nothing, not a sound, not a footprint, not a clue, just the quiet dread that settles when people realize the woods they grew up beside no longer feel familiar. But now, as she emerged from that same darkness, her small shoulders trembling in the cold morning air, there was something different about her. Something wrong. Her father ran to her first. She didn't reach for him. She didn't even seem to recognize him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the tree line, as though something was still standing there, watching. And when he tried to lift her into his arms, she whispered the first and only words she would say for days, words that sank into the town's bones like a winter chill. He said, "I'm his now." No one asked who he was. They didn't need to. Everyone in that valley had heard the stories, the family that lived beyond the creek, the family that hadn't married outside their own blood for generations, the family that rarely appeared in daylight. Some believed they were just myths meant to scare children. But when they saw that crude twig ring on her trembling hand, the myths didn't feel like stories anymore. The disappearance of the girl began on a morning so ordinary that no one in the valley could later explain how it turned so quietly tragic. She left home with a small woven basket, the kind she carried every day when she went to gather herbs for her grandmother, and her mother watched her skip down the path with the easy trust of a child who believed the woods were her playground instead of the place adults whispered about after dark. The sun was gentle, the birds were awake, and nothing seemed out of place as she disappeared between the first line of trees. She had taken that path dozens of times, knew every bend and stone, but later, when people tried to retrace her steps, it was as if the forest itself had swallowed her tracks before anyone had realized she was missing. Hours passed before her mother began to worry. It wasn't unusual for the girl to lose track of time, but something about the stillness that afternoon felt different, as though the woods were holding their breath. When the sun dipped low and the girl still hadn't returned, the search began. Neighbors gathered lanterns, fathers grabbed rifles, and mothers clutched shawls around their shoulders as they called her name into the growing dusk. Her father insisted she must have wandered too far, that she'd be found near the creek or picking berries in the low meadow, but even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice as the sky darkened. By nightfall, the woods seemed to shift around them, every rustle sounding like a footstep, every broken twig snapping like a child in distress. Yet nothing answered their calls. The forest gave back no echoes, no clues, only the eerie sense that they were being watched by something just beyond the reach of their lantern glow. When someone finally spotted the small piece of torn ribbon caught on a thorn bush, the searchers froze. It was the same ribbon the girl had worn in her hair that morning, a faded yellow bow now shredded at the edges as though torn by force or desperate hands. The bush around it was strangely flattened, as if someone or something had crouched there for a long while. They fanned out in every direction, following imagined trails and shadows, but no more signs appeared. Her name was shouted until voices cracked, until lanterns died one by one, until the cold made their fingers stiff. By dawn, the only thing they found was a circle of disturbed leaves leading deeper into the woods, a faint pattern like something had been dragged or carried, and though no one said it aloud, a creeping dread settled over them as they realized the girl had not simply wandered off on her own but had been taken into a part of the forest that no one in town dared to enter anymore, a part rumored to belong to a family long forgotten by the outside world and untouched by anything resembling mercy or reason, and as the searchers stood at the edge of that forbidden boundary, none of them could shake the feeling that the trees were hiding something alive, patient, and waiting for them to cross it. In the days following the girl's disappearance, the townspeople began speaking in quieter tones, their conversations turning toward the old whispers they had spent years pretending not to believe. It started with a single remark from an elderly woman who had lived in the valley long before most of the younger families arrived. She said the woods had always belonged to more than just the deer and the hunters, that there were people out there who didn't come into town unless necessity forced them. Her voice shook when she mentioned the old family, the one that lived so far beyond the creek that even the bravest locals avoided the narrow footpath leading to their side of the forest. The townsfolk had a name for them once, but it had faded into something softer, something more like a warning than a label, because no one wanted to speak of them directly. Stories had lingered for generations about how that family kept to themselves so fiercely that they refused any marriage outside their own bloodline, claiming outsiders brought disease, bad luck, or worse. They believed purity came from isolation, and they wore that belief like a shield against the rest of the world. Parents would tell their children not to wander too deep into the woods, not because of wolves or cliffs but because they feared the old family might still be out there, watching from behind the moss-covered trunks. Most people dismissed these tales as superstitions of an older era, relics from a time when fear ruled easier than reason. But as the girl's absence stretched from hours to days, those stories crept back into everyone's mind, bringing with them questions no one wanted to voice. They remembered the strange occurrences over the years, livestock disappearing without tracks leading away, campfires spotted at impossible distances between the trees, silhouettes seen at dusk moving in slow, unnatural patterns. Some recalled the rare moments when a member of that secluded bloodline had wandered into town, always at dusk, always silent, with features so symmetrical they felt unsettling, like faces drawn too perfectly by an unskilled hand. The oldest residents swore that the family had once been normal, just farmers and hunters who lived a quiet life away from the bustle. But isolation changed them. Generation after generation married within their own circle, shrinking their world until the only faces they knew were reflections of their own. Over time, their language turned strange, their customs stranger, and their appearances took on a quality that made outsiders instinctively uneasy. People wondered if they were still out there or if they had finally died out as the woods swallowed their homestead. But the sudden reappearance of old fear suggested otherwise, and the idea that such a family might still exist deep in the forest made the silence surrounding the girl's disappearance feel heavier, as though the entire valley had been holding its breath for years, waiting for something like this to happen again. The hunters' sightings began as little more than muttered recollections shared over a cup of bitter coffee at the general store, the kind of talk most people would dismiss as tricks of the early morning light. But the man who reported them wasn't known for exaggeration. He'd spent decades navigating those woods, moving through the underbrush with the quiet precision of someone who understood that the forest only tolerated those who respected its silence. So when he said he saw something he couldn't explain, people listened even if they pretended not to. He claimed the first sighting happened just after dawn, near the ridge where the trees grew thin and the ground dipped into a natural hollow. He had been tracking a deer when he noticed a figure standing unnaturally still between two dead pines. At first he assumed it was another hunter, but as he drew closer, he realized the posture was wrong. The man didn't shift his weight or turn his head. He stood stiffly, as though his limbs obeyed out of memory rather than instinct, and when the hunter tried to call out, the figure's face remained disturbingly vacant. The hunter described the man's features as too symmetrical, almost mirrored, with a pallor that blended too easily into the morning fog. What unsettled him most, however, wasn't the man's appearance but the small shape beside him. Through the haze, he saw what looked like a child's silhouette, a girl with hair matted against her cheeks, her shoulders trembling slightly as though she had been crying for hours. He took a step closer, trying to see her face, but before he could, the strange man placed a rigid hand on her shoulder and guided her deeper into the hollow. They didn't run. They didn't react to his presence at all. They simply moved with that same unnatural slowness, disappearing into the tree line as though swallowed by the forest itself. Later that afternoon, the hunter decided to return to the spot, hoping he'd find a clue to explain what he had witnessed, perhaps footprints or discarded belongings. Instead, he found the ground oddly undisturbed, the soil packed as if many feet had once passed there but had somehow erased their own traces. The only sign of recent presence was a faint indentation in the moss, shaped almost like a child's knee, pressed deep into the earth. When he mentioned the sightings to the townspeople, most dismissed it as stress from the ongoing search, but the older residents exchanged uneasy glances. They remembered descriptions from decades ago, of men from that secluded bloodline who moved with an eerie stiffness, who seemed detached from the world around them, who appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. The hunter couldn't shake the feeling that the girl he saw wasn't wandering willingly. The way she leaned, the way she trembled, the way she avoided turning her head, it all suggested fear held tight in her throat. And though no one wanted to admit it, The hunter's sighting aligned too closely with the darkest whispers of the old family, making it harder for anyone to cling to the hope that the missing girl was merely lost and not being led deeper into a part of the woods no one wished to enter. When the search party stumbled upon the cabin, it happened almost by accident. They had been following a series of faint disturbances in the underbrush, broken twigs, patches of earth that looked recently pressed down, when one of the men noticed a slanted roof barely visible through a curtain of overgrown vines. The structure sat in a shallow clearing, so deeply claimed by nature that most of the townspeople had forgotten it even existed. Some of the older men remembered stories about an outpost once used by trappers, but as they approached, it became clear this cabin had not been abandoned in the way a normal human dwelling would be. Something had lived there. Something still might be living there. Its door hung crooked on rusted hinges, the windows covered with boards so warped they resembled melted planks rather than anything cut by tools. But the most unsettling detail was what had been carved into the exterior wood, strange symbols gouged deep into the boards with a blade, their shapes unfamiliar and disturbing, like a mixture of crude runes and animal scratches. They weren't decorative. They looked like warnings, but whether warning others outside or those within was a question none of them wanted to answer. The carvings circled the cabin entirely, arranged in a pattern so deliberate that even the least superstitious among the group felt uneasy. As they moved closer, the air around the structure felt heavier, as though the clearing itself held its breath. One man reached out and touched a symbol with his gloved hand, then quickly pulled back, insisting the wood felt unnaturally warm despite the cold morning air. Another tried to peek through a slit between the boards, but darkness swallowed his gaze instantly, giving him the unsettling sensation that something on the other side was staring back. They called the missing girl's name several times, their voices sounding too loud in the unnatural quiet. The forest, usually alive with the crackle of leaves or the chatter of birds, had fallen silent, and each minute stretched longer than it should have. Finally, one of the braver men pushed on the cabin door. It groaned but didn't give way. A thick chain was looped through the inside latch, suggesting whoever inhabited the place preferred to keep the world out or to keep something locked inside. The men exchanged nervous glances before circling the cabin again, searching for a back entrance or a window left ajar. Instead, they found more symbols and what appeared to be dried streaks of mud or possibly old blood smeared beneath the carvings. The ground near the rear corner was disturbed in a pattern that looked almost ritualistic, with small bones scattered in an odd formation. They didn't touch them. They barely breathed near them. The longer they stood in the clearing, the stronger the sense grew that the cabin was not just hidden by accident but deliberately concealed, as though the forest itself had grown around it to keep it secret. And as the searchers finally backed away, each man felt the same cold realization: whoever had taken the girl might not be hiding from the town but living in a place designed to repel outsiders entirely, a place where the woods closed in too tightly and the walls were marked by symbols designed to warn anyone foolish enough to come closer. The discovery of the strange footprint happened on the third day of searching near the cabin, when the searchers had grown so exhausted that even the smallest clue felt like a lifeline. The ground around the structure had been strangely undisturbed before, almost as if someone had swept away evidence, but a cold rain the night before softened the soil enough to reveal impressions that hadn't been there earlier. One of the younger men spotted them first, a pair of footprints leading from the back of the cabin toward a patch of dense brush. At first glance, they looked human, but as the group knelt to examine them, the unease that had been hovering over the search hardened into something closer to fear. The footprints were mismatched in size, one appearing normal for an adult man, the other oddly smaller and twisted at the arch. It looked as though the same person had stepped with two entirely different shapes of foot, as if one side of the body knew how to walk properly while the other didn't. This asymmetry made every man freeze. In the dim morning light, the prints looked fresh, their edges still sharp, suggesting that whoever made them had passed through recently, possibly within the last few hours. The thought of being so close to the person who had taken the girl chilled each of them, especially because the prints didn't follow a straight path. They meandered, looping in strange angles, as though the person walked in circles or couldn't decide which direction to go. More disturbing still was the slight dragging impression behind the smaller footprint, like something, maybe a foot, maybe a piece of cloth, had been pulled along with it. One of the men whispered that no healthy human walked like that, and the others said nothing because they had all been thinking the same thing. The strange gate matched the stories of the old family, the ones who were rumored to be born with bodies altered by generations of isolation. Those who had glimpsed them decades ago spoke of stiff movements, uneven shoulders, and limbs that didn't align the way they should. But seeing this distortion pressed into wet earth made those whispered tales feel painfully real. As they followed the tracks deeper into the brush, they noticed the pattern shift again. The footprints grew farther apart, the stride lengthening unnaturally, as though the person had suddenly moved faster or began lurching forward in long, disjointed steps. The dragging mark became more pronounced, creating a faint, wavering line in the mud. Then, abruptly, the tracks stopped at a cluster of exposed tree roots where the soil turned dry. There were no more impressions beyond that point, no broken branches, no disturbed foliage, nothing to indicate where the figure had gone. It was as though the trail had been intentionally cut off. The searchers stared at the spot in frustrated silence, feeling the forest closing in again. The prints had offered a glimpse into the presence they were dealing with, but instead of bringing clarity, they deepened the mystery. If these tracks belonged to the man rumored to be living in those woods, then he wasn't just reclusive, he was something altered, something strange, something capable of moving in ways the rest of them couldn't understand, and the idea that he might still be wandering nearby made every whisper of wind sound like a footstep behind them. The discovery of the old diary happened when one of the older townsmen remembered that his grandfather had once kept records of his time working with a traveling missionary group in the valley. The book had been tucked away in a dust-covered trunk in the attic, bound in cracked leather that looked ready to crumble at the slightest touch. When they opened it, the scent of old paper and mildew drifted out, but it was the ink, faded but still legible, that held their attention. The entries began with ordinary notes about weather, illness, and the missionaries' attempts to teach reading and prayer to families scattered across the region. But as the pages turned, the handwriting grew more frantic, the sentences sharper, as if the man who wrote them had begun to realize he was witnessing something beyond his understanding. One entry from the late 1920s described an encounter with a hidden family who refused to leave their woodland settlement. The missionary wrote about hearing muted voices speaking a dialect he couldn't recognize, about seeing children who stared with vacant expressions, and about adults whose movements seemed disjointed, as though their bodies obeyed some inner logic different from his own. Then the diary shifted tone entirely. A particular entry, dated in trembling cursive, spoke of a young girl who had been taken against her will to become a child bride. The missionary wrote that she was only 9, frail and terrified, and had been claimed by a man from that secluded family who insisted she had been promised long before she was born. The description of the man was unsettling, a gaunt figure with a narrow face, pale eyes, and a stiffness in his limbs that made him appear more like a puppet than a living human. The missionary had attempted to intervene, offering to bring the girl back to her family, but the surrounding woods had filled with figures emerging from the shadows, silent men and women with matching features, their presence enough to force him to retreat. In his later pages, he wrote that he could still hear the girl crying as he fled, but that her voice was swallowed by the thick rustle of leaves and the low murmurs of the Inbred clan. He returned multiple times to try to rescue her, but each attempt was met with the same impenetrable silence and the same overwhelming sense that he was trespassing somewhere human beings were not meant to enter. As the searchers read through the final entries, they realized they were not the first to face this nightmare. The diary described symbols carved into trees, strange footprints around the family's settlement, and a chilling note about how the forest seemed to protect them, closing behind them like a living barrier. No record ever confirmed what happened to the girl from the 1920s, only that she vanished completely, just as the 8-year-old girl had now. The parallels were too precise to ignore, and the men reading the diary felt a tightening in their throats as they understood that history was repeating itself and whatever force had taken that child a century ago might still be lingering in the woods, unchanged and waiting for its next bride. When the girl finally returned to the town, it was in a way that no one had anticipated. She appeared silently at the edge of the main road, her small frame hunched as though the weight of days in the woods had pressed her down into herself. Her dress, once bright and clean, was streaked with mud and torn in several places, and her hair hung in damp tangles around her face. People ran toward her at first, their relief mingled with fear, but she did not respond to their voices or gestures. Her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the tree line, unblinking and vacant, as though she were seeing something that the rest of the world could not. Her mother's cry rang out, and her father reached for her, calling her name over and over, but she recoiled slightly, gripping the small ring of twigs tightly in her hands as if it were a talisman against some unseen force. The townspeople gathered quickly around, their faces pale with shock and unease. They could see the faint scratches on her arms and legs, remnants of branches or perhaps something more sinister, though she showed no sign of acknowledging them. Her lips moved as if forming words, but no sound came, and for hours she remained like that, staring into nothing, shaking slightly as if the forest itself had been pressing against her and she could not escape the memory of it. Some of the older residents whispered that the girl had been marked, not just physically, but in some way that would follow her forever. They spoke of previous generations who had encountered the family deep in the woods and returned with the same hollow expression, their spirits touched by something unnatural, something that rewrote the child's sense of safety and understanding. The twig ring she clutched became a focal point of the town's growing unease. It was crudely woven, yet symmetrical in its strange way, almost ritualistic. None of the adults could recall seeing such craftsmanship, and yet it was impossible to ignore the sense of intention behind it. Some suggested that it was a gift, a symbol of possession from the man she had been taken to, and the idea made more than one grown man shiver. Attempts to coax her into speaking or explain where she had been met with silence or slight, unresponsive movements. She would only tilt her head slightly toward the forest when asked questions, and that subtle motion carried a weight far greater than words. Over the following days, the girl refused to interact with anyone outside her immediate family, and even they could not pierce the wall of detachment she had built around herself. She slept little, sometimes waking in the night and wandering to the edge of the woods, her tiny figure illuminated by the moon as if drawn toward something only she could perceive. Her return was not a return at all, it was the arrival of a presence that belonged partially to the town, partially to the forest, and entirely to the memory of the family she had encountered. The people who watched her could feel the threads of the mystery tugging at them, sensing that what had happened in those days lost among the trees was not merely a story of disappearance, but the beginning of a deeper, darker pattern they had barely begun to comprehend. As the nights stretched on after the girl's return, the forest seemed to grow louder in ways that no one could explain. It began with a faint wailing, a sound that drifted through the trees just as darkness fell, soft at first, almost like the wind moving through dead branches. People told themselves it was nothing, a fox or an owl, or perhaps the wind catching in the hollows of the old trees. But then the cries began to carry a shape, a rhythm that was unmistakably human. The sound resembled a child crying, desperate and lonely, echoing in the valleys between the thick trunks, bouncing off moss-covered boulders, and yet it seemed to come from all directions at once. Families huddled indoors, locking doors and windows, while parents whispered warnings to their children about venturing near the forest after dusk. Those brave or foolish enough to look out reported seeing glimpses of small figures moving between the trees, too quick, too fleeting to be caught in the lantern light. Sometimes the shape resembled the missing girl, and for a heartbeat, the watchers would hope it was her returning, only to realize the figure would vanish when they tried to approach. The sound of footsteps followed, but none matched human cadence. Twigs snapped as if someone ran on tiptoe, yet the leaves below remained mostly undisturbed, adding to the sense that the forest itself was alive with something that obeyed its own unnatural rules. Dogs barked at nothing and refused to enter yards closest to the tree line, and even the most skeptical adults could not deny the feeling that eyes were watching, unseen but aware. As the nights continued, multiple residents began reporting that the wails occasionally morphed into mimicry. The cries sounded exactly like the girl's voice, her pitch, her inflections, but twisted somehow, longer, sharper, filled with a terror she had not exhibited in daylight. It was as though something was learning her, repeating her, shaping her essence into sound. One old man said he could hear the difference, that the voice coming from the woods carried an unfamiliar weight, a possessiveness that seemed to command the forest itself. The fear grew so tangible that people avoided stepping outside after sunset, leaving empty streets and silent homes. Even in daylight, the sense lingered, as though the cries had awakened something older and more patient in the woods. Shadows seemed to move differently near the tree line, stretching longer than they should, bending in ways that made no logical sense. The forest, which had always been a backdrop to the town, became a character of its own, alive, attentive, and hungry for the night. And every night, no matter how far the girl stayed from the trees, the echoes of those cries reminded the townspeople that whatever had taken her, whatever had brought her back, was not done, and that the sounds drifting through the woods were a warning that the story of her capture had never truly ended. The revelation of the man's identity sent a chill through the town that lingered long after the initial shock had passed. Whispers had been circulating for weeks, but now, as the truth unfolded, it became clear that the missing girl had been forced into the company of someone whose very existence was the product of generations of isolation. He was the last surviving male of the secluded bloodline that had lived deep in the woods, a man whose ancestors had married only within their own family for more than a century. The result was a figure who appeared both familiar and alien at the same time, his features disturbingly symmetrical, his movements stiff and deliberate, as though his body obeyed rules set long before he was born. Locals who caught glimpses of him described the uncanny sense that his face was too perfect, too controlled, lacking the natural subtleties that make human expression readable. Some insisted they had seen him standing in the shadows of the trees at night, watching the town, always silent, always waiting. As the story of his forced marriage to the girl emerged, details surfaced that made people's stomachs turn. He was not only inbred but had been raised in a household where the concept of morality was warped by generations of insularity. His understanding of relationships, family, and consent had been shaped entirely by a culture that prized the preservation of blood over the well-being of the individual. The townspeople began to understand why he had abducted the girl so easily and why she had returned carrying only a crude twig ring. In his mind, she was not a child to be protected or nurtured, but a vessel to continue the family line. This realization made the forest itself feel alive with menace, as if the trees had conspired with him to hide the girl, to shield him from the eyes of those who would stop him. Attempts to confront him had failed. Hunters and searchers reported seeing him in glimpses only, moving through the underbrush like a shadow with unnatural rigidity, vanishing when approached, leaving behind nothing but broken twigs and a faint impression in the soil. Stories from decades past, preserved in old diaries and whispered warnings, aligned too closely with his presence. Children taken for purposes beyond comprehension, adults warning outsiders to stay away, and rituals so old that no one alive had seen their origin. The thought that he might have been watching the girl from a distance, waiting for the right moment to reclaim her, made every parent in town feel a helpless chill. Even the girl's own return could not erase the danger he posed. Though she had come back, the influence of the man who claimed her, an obsession rooted in centuries of isolation and distortion, remained palpable. Her vacant expressions, her strange attachment to the twig ring, and her recurring sleepwalking toward the forest all spoke to the hold he had over her. The realization settled over the town like a storm cloud. They were not merely dealing with a missing child, or even an inbred man. They were facing a lineage of distorted obsession, one that had been preserved and perfected over generations, and whose last living heir held a terrifying claim over the girl who had unknowingly become the center of his world. The nights that followed the girl's return were some of the longest the town had ever endured, filled with a tension that seemed to seep into every house and street. Almost immediately, her family noticed a troubling pattern. Each night, as the moon climbed higher into the sky, she would rise quietly from her bed and move toward the edge of the forest. At first, they thought she was sleepwalking, but there was something deliberate in her movements, a careful tread as if she knew exactly where she was going. The twig ring she had returned with was always clutched in her hand, the braided twigs pressing into her small palm like a guiding talisman. Doors were locked, windows latched, but somehow she evaded all barriers, slipping past guardians who could not understand how such a fragile child could navigate the darkness with such certainty. The townspeople, hearing rumors, grew increasingly anxious. They spoke in hushed tones about the man she had been forced to marry, the last surviving heir of the isolated family whose history was written in whispers and fear. Stories that had once seemed like old cautionary tales were now frighteningly real. Those who had glimpsed him in the shadows described a figure moving unnaturally, limbs stiff and precise, watching with pale, unblinking eyes. The girl's nightly wanderings seemed almost like a summoning, as if something in her, whether fear or compulsion, was drawing her back toward the man who claimed her, toward the cabin hidden deep in the trees. The woods themselves seemed to conspire with him, the path she followed unchanged and unbroken despite the rain and fallen branches, as though some invisible force cleared the way in anticipation of her return. Families who lived near the forest reported hearing faint cries echoing in the night, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that no child could sustain alone. Sometimes the sound was unmistakably hers, fragile and pleading. Other times it seemed distorted, layered with an unnatural tone that hinted at someone or something mimicking her. The fear in the valley grew tangible, spreading from home to home as parents clutched their children, praying that whatever force beckoned the girl could be resisted. The searchers tried to follow her, but each attempt ended in frustration. The forest seemed to shift, paths disappearing, shadows elongating in impossible ways, guiding her deeper into territory the town had long feared to enter. Her sleepwalking became an unspoken countdown, a nightly reminder that the man who had claimed her was not idle. Every step she took toward the woods brought the possibility of a final confrontation closer, a meeting that the townspeople dreaded yet felt powerless to prevent. They realized that she was being drawn back not just by her own will but by the pull of a presence that had shaped her world, an obsession honed over generations of inbreeding, isolation, and secrecy. The tension in the valley thickened, as everyone understood that the girl's nightly journey might soon lead to a reckoning between the living and the remnants of a family long thought lost to the shadows of the woods.